All right, we'll look at part 4, our final part of our natural selection notes. Please make sure you've been taking these into your student notebook found online. You never know when it might be a good time to have, say an open note test or something. So please be copying these down and watching these videos, okay? I'm not trying to waste my time. I want you to learn something. That's why I want to make these videos, even you that are, stuck at home. So anyway, we've learned about, let's just backtrack a little bit. We learned about natural selection last time. This is the main part. That's why it's titled our unit. We saw the characteristics that needs to take place or that do take place in populations of whatever organisms we're talking about, animals, plants, bacteria even. That has to take place for natural selection to occur. Remember what natural selection really is. It's where an adaptation or a feature, a trait of some type of organism makes it more likely to survive and reproduce than same organisms that do not have this adaptation or this trait. All right? So kind of coined this term survival of the fittest, and you've likely heard that before. So let's look at what natural selection looks like after it takes time to take place in populations of organisms. So within a population of a certain species, so if we're talking about these penguins right here, you see that population is groups of the same species that live kind of close to each other. There might be a wide range of phenotypes. And remember back to our learning about genetics, phenotypes is how a trait appears physically, what you can see, all right, what comes out of the genes, phenotype. And if there's more variation or more diversity within phenotypes, it's good for the species, okay? Because it's more likely that some individuals in this population can survive if the environment changes, right? Let's just say, for example, there's a bear. And these certain species of bear have lots and lots of different types, thickness of fur coat, right? So some of them have really thick fur, some of them have not so thick fur. And let's think about what happens in their environment. What if their environment suddenly gets very, very cold, right? The adaptation that some of them have having very, very thick fur is a good thing. They're going to be able to survive. Sadly, the ones with thinner fur, they may die out, or they're going to be less likely to survive and reproduce and make more that are similar to them, right? This variation allowed them all to live, or at least part of them to live. If all of these bears had thin coats and it got suddenly very, very cold, there's a good chance or a higher likelihood chance that that population would die out, possibly even go into the point of extinction, depending on how widespread that population is. There's a term called allele frequency. Remember, allele is a part of a gene, right? It's a little segment of the DNA. Frequency, how often it pops up. So this is the measure of how common an allele is in a population, right? And this allele frequency can change. It's normally based on a percentage. So 80% of the bear population has very thick coats, right? Eventually, if natural selection occurs and all those thin coat bears die out, it may be closer to like 98% of them have thick fur coats. So allele frequency. Over time, and this is what we just talked about, certain phenotypes, so these alleles will become more common because of natural selection. Go back to Darwin's finches. The reason they had all these different beak shapes was because based on their environment, what food was available to them on their islands, right? And so some birds with certain types of beaks did better than other types of beaks on birds, right? And it kind of adapted, or it did adapt to whatever food source was on that island. I want us to look at, there's 3 main types of natural selection and what happens, okay? This is after natural selection's been occurring, and it's kind of some data and some charts, but don't get lost up in that. Listen to our examples, and it kind of makes sense how it goes. So we've got this wide variety of whatever trait it is we're talking about, whether it's bear fur coats or, as we're going to look at these 3 different examples here. The modes of selection is how it swings. Okay, what adaptations are better and beneficial over time? So what the outcome of natural selection is. The first type of selection is called directional selection. And this is simply, look at this chart. So if we've got all these different traits, get out of the way thing. Some of them will be over here on the chart, some of them will be over here on the chart. A directional selection means it goes to one of the extremes of the range of traits. Think our bears, for example. It would have been a directional selection. It went from somewhere in the middle of how many alleles there were or how many bears there were with different types of fur coats to all of a sudden we've got a whole lot more. It moved in the direction of that thick fur coat. Same bears, let's take them and all of a sudden it gets very, very, very hot, right? Those thinner coated bears would have been better adapted to their environment as it changed. So directional selection, it would have moved it down probably this direction, right? If this was, thin fur and this was thick fur. So directional, it moves in one direction, right? Towards one of the extremes of a range of traits. A wonderful example is something called antibiotic resistant bacteria, right? When we get sick from a bacterial infection, what do we take? Antibiotics. Okay, antibiotics is the medicine that we take to kill the bacteria that's causing an infection. We've really seen over the last couple of decades what's happening is that these antibiotics are working great. They're killing the bacteria. They're making us healthy and everything. But bacteria being an organism, there's a range of traits. All right, I'm going to look to the next slide and just kind of walk you through this. So we've got these bacteria, this whole big conglomeration of them here, this population. But in a few of them, there may be this mutation that makes them resistant to antibiotics. In other words, the antibiotics don't kill them. They're just immune to the antibiotics. So as we're popping these antibiotics, it's killing all these other guys. Boop, 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 boop. These antibiotic ones, or resistant bacteria, are living. And what are they doing? They're surviving, just like in this picture here. And they start to multiply, and their offspring has this same mutation, this same allele that makes them resistant to antibiotics. And now we're actually starting to see bacteria that the antibiotic that worked 10 years ago doesn't work at all. And it's natural selection, it's directional selection. The antibiotics are killing off. We've changed the environment, right? We're putting a drug in our bodies where this bacteria exists, and it's killing off all these that, used to be the majority in the population. Now, these minority ones that had this mutation suddenly have become the majority. So what we're having to do as humans is change our antibiotics. We're having to, add different things to them to hopefully kill those bacteria that are causing infections. This is directional selection. Okay, it moved. There was a frequency of not very many with this mutation for antibiotic resistant. All of a sudden, shoop, the population has completely changed. And these graphs are really just showing like a distribution of the different types of alleles, right? So we'd have a whole lot that had this certain was very, resistant to the drugs or wasn't resistant to the drugs, and then it kind of does this bell curve. Okay, don't worry so much about the charts. Worry more about the definition. Directional, it moves to one of the extremes. Stabilizing selection is what happens over time with natural selection, in which the favored trait, the one that's good, the one that helped them survive, is somewhere in the middle of the range of traits. Don't worry about these mosquito, woodpeckers, wasps, whatever they are. We're not talking about that one. I just want you to see the chart. How, see, it kind of pinches up. It stabilizes itself in the middle. Let's talk about human birth weight. Now, this is all prior to C-sections. If you don't know what C-section is, it's when, most of you probably heard of this before, it's when a baby's not able to come out of the mother vaginally or naturally. Instead, they have to make an incision right below the belly button, and they cut that baby out of them, right? My wife had 2 C-sections. That's how both my daughters were born. They had to make an incision and cut into my wife's uterus to pull my babies out through, in essence, her belly. So anyway, before this happened, okay, let's talk about before, because this completely changed all of this. But think about what was happening with human birth weight. We had this frequency of alleles, right? We had, let's say, low birth weight over here, so tiny babies. Over here, we had big-headed babies, or really big birth weight babies, right? And so we probably had this little pink curve. Most of them fell in the middle, but we still had this kind of distribution this way and that way. What began to happen, though, and this is a little sad, what began to happen, though, was the low birth weight babies over here, sadly, they didn't make it. Maybe they didn't survive childbirth because, they were not very healthy. They didn't have the immune system they needed, a variety of reasons. And sadly, we still see this today. But hopefully not near as frequent because of modern medicine. Over here, these huge babies. Now, prior to C-section, so mom tried to deliver these babies naturally or vaginally. And this baby was so big that a lot of times it would hurt the mom. It would possibly even cause her to bleed more and possibly die. And what we were seeing before C-sections was this group over here was dying off at a very high rate. This group over here of big weighted babies was dying off too. A lot of times taking the mom with them. So we started seeing this stabilization. this population was dead. This population was dead as well. That's sad to talk about. We saw a whole lot more in this stabilizing selection. So the favored trait was actually kind of in the middle. An average birth weight was more ideal. It helped them survive. And there is some things that go along with it with genetics. If you were a very large baby when you were born, chances are higher that your babies are going to be bigger. Thankfully, especially in the modern world, we have C-sections, right? So my wife and my children are healthy. They came through fine. If they didn't have C-sections, chances are great it would have been complications. Not because both my daughters were super huge. They were turned funny. So anyway, human birth weights is stabilizing selection. We see this a good bit in nature too. Now, let's talk about one that we don't see very frequently. It's called disruptive selection. It's when you have extremes of both of them, of these range of traits, or what's favored. Like I said, much rarer. There's a bird called the lazuli bunting bird. Lazuli bunting bird comes in a variety of colors, from really drab, ugly brown to really bright, vibrant blue. And what begins to happen in these populations these are the males, by the way. The females all kind of look the same. But the males, you have brown, lighter brown, brownish blue even, with kind of a mixture, and then you kind of see some drab blue, and then you see some really bright blue. Now in the middle we would normally have an even distribution of alleles, right? But here's what happens. The bright blue ones are the most sought after. The females love these bright blue ones. The bright blue ones will typically kill off any of them here in the middle to try to be the head alpha bird, right? And to mate with the females. So we see a huge swing in the population of blue ones because the females aren't wanting to mate with these in the middle, and the blue ones are actually killing them off. Now that would be directional selection, but the lazuli bunting bird's interesting in that these bright blue ones here care nothing about the drab brown ones. They don't go after them. They don't try to kill them. They don't try to run them off or anything like that. They're just kind of safe over there. Now, what happens is when there's no other males to mate with, the bright blue ones have already mated or they've gone somewhere else, the females will then turn to the drab brown ones that were left alone and just kind of hanging out. And so we've started to see this disruptive selection where it went from this normal distribution of alleles to now there's a lot more drab brown ones and a lot more bright blue ones because these are the ones sought after, but these are the ones being left alone. And when these aren't available, the females tend to go with these, drab brown ones. So you see how disruptive, it's very rare, but both extremes are more favored. So it doesn't just move in one direction, or it don't just close in on the middle like with the C-sections where we kind of get an average or normal birth weight. We get these disruptive selection. And the last thing, you might have heard of it before. It's called sexual selection. This isn't really a mode of selection, but I did want to throw it in here because we'll bring it up in some other chapters. And we just brought it up a little bit. It's when a trait increases mating success. Think about peacocks. Male peacocks. This is a female peacock here. Nothing to write home about. Just a plain old bird. This is a male peacock. Look how his feathers is ridiculously awesome. Deer, same way. Like reindeer, moose, all that kind of stuff. Large antlers on males are attractive to the females. And so what you see is females being drawn to the brightly colored peacocks, the ones that are more prettier feathers or plumage than the other ones. Or with deer, females are drawn to the, this is sexual selection, drawn to the big, bucks with huge antlers. And so what happens is the brightly colored peacock or the deer with huge antlers has more chances to mate, right? And more chances to pass on its traits to the next generation. So with sexual selection, and there are some cases where it goes the other way, the female is brightly colored and males are drawn to them. We see it a good bit. We'll see it in some when we talk about ecology and look at ecosystems, about how I believe it's some other little birds, and then there's insects and frogs and things like that. Sexual selection happens all the time in the nature world. It's where a trait increases mating success. They're more likely to mate, therefore more likely to pass on their traits to the next generation. All right? So that's the end of our notes with natural selection. I hope you've learned a little bit. Don't be afraid to go back and rewatch videos like I told you at the very beginning. Please put these in your notes. Use this information to take your quizzes and to learn a little more and hopefully, ace the exam.